This video starts with a short clip from the Searle Hadamech collection of conversations with the famous Norman Maclean, sadly no longer with us, but well known as a writer, singer, piper, actor, comedian, and all-round entertainer. After the clip comes a discussion between linguists at universities in Scotland, India, and Jamaica working together on the Mediating Multilingualism project, and other interested individuals with a close professional, parental, or community involvement in language and languages. Hello and welcome to our third and final session of our Talking Points with Norman Maclean discussion series, in which we'll be looking at the topic of language contact and addressing the question of bilingual balance. Can it be achieved? So in the first session, we were talking about language trajectories, the susceptibility of languages for their place in a community to change over time and in practice. And in the second session, our focus was more on language hierarchies and the way we tend, for example, to rank languages in our own minds or in a collective consciousness, perhaps. Both of these discussions entail implicitly some kind of notion of comparison between languages. And that's often expressed in competitive terms. But at the end of our last session, we were beginning to think about the word accommodation. And I suppose what we might be challenging ourselves to do in this session is to try and envisage a situation where languages in contact are not necessarily languages in competition, but where there could be an equitable accommodation, so that in any linguistic head, the two partners vying for attention in there are not actually vying, but they're complementing each other rather than competing with each other. So is there a positive way of dealing with bilingualism? Something which is additive rather than subtractive, for example. So we'll start, as usual, with a clip from Norman's Searle Hadamech. And we have the same panel as with the two previous sessions. So again, there's no need for introductions here, and we can move straight to looking at Norman's first clip, remembering again that this is a highlights version of a longer clip, and you can find the link to that longer clip in the YouTube information underneath this video.
Hanakadach Kate is the Nachgvadi Halvam, share Boomaleda as a statue noon, Donald Trump.
Oh, sure.
Nicht Skinjoch if I had nominations on the Republicans. Ach, dus toch heet in het doen Anje wordt ze maar wechselen, dat is me heet in het doen zat de kruik prachtig bij Donald's man. Anje toch gelet, hanek jutoch gelet Anje nog, ach gelet Italy, agus. She's kudig, hanach gaan gaan.
Hey.
Als je een café maar gebug aan de ghetto beelden. Had de vesting killen op in de vanaf Mexico. Als met vergedoer, globalization, liberal capitalism. Had de als je een café vier. Als had de swoonjen mag dat ik had hem. Denk Christen slaan hier. Ach, ik ken er nummers, gaan ze wat is weer naar per, naar Rotterdam, Oakland, Californië, naar Florida, naar Texas even. Is Spanisch werken goed ook. Heb ik het gewoon vier. Zo ha kunnen staan. Die Gaelic le ungaan in de waan. Ik had ook al how na spúilte bhí fíois agus a bhí de gabhah I de jawah sashing. Ach na canna nilachad hasú the sheer lietach mui agus futu rugi, you know, futu chohugi, you know.
So that was Norman. And this time, that's not the only clip of him which we'll be watching. We've got another one which will be finishing our recording. So that's going to be looking at, give us some examples of his use, his equal facility in both English and Gaelic. So it seems quite fitting to have that when we're discussing bilingualism and language contact. And it's something, it's a clip which we can be looking forward to during this debate, as well as the one which we've just watched, which we can look back on to inform the points which we wish to make. But now it's Joseph's turn to kick off our discussion. So I'm going to ask him to speak for about 10 minutes, first of all, on his own response to what we've just seen.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I want to speak about the normalization of the ghetto. And this, of course, is building on what Norman has said about operating in one language. There are, thousands of communities on the planet. And many of those communities speak multiple languages. There are a few powerful communities that only speak one language, where the members speak only one language. But for some reason, what has become normalized is monolingualism, as if it is the dominant pattern. But as you go throughout the world, you find that generally people are able to speak multiple languages. And so I agree with Gordon that monolingualism is a ghetto. Why is it a ghetto? Because it is a narrowly circumscribed world. Yeah, if we see a language as providing a worldview, a way of seeing, a way of experiencing the world, when you operate in just one language, then you have a limited view of the world and you only have one view of the world. But as I said, for some reason, that ghetto of monolingualism has been normalized. And this follows up on discussions we have been having over these past several sessions about how languages are deployed in communities and also the power relations that exist between languages. Now, in situations where a community speaks only one language, and that language is the global language or the dominant language, then that community believes that it does not have to accommodate to anybody else. And you can see this in action as people from the United States, people from the United Kingdom go abroad, whether that's for holidays or business meetings, that the expectation is that wherever on the planet they turn up for their vacation, English will be spoken there. And very few of them will attempt to learn even a few phrases and so from the local language. And I find that it's actually people who speak languages other than English, who when they are preparing to go abroad to a country or a community that doesn't speak their language, they are the ones who tend to buy phrase books they're the ones who try to prepare to at least say a few words, a few phrases in the language of that community. And so existence in the ghetto also provides the sort of mindset for that ghetto to perpetuate. That since we speak the global language, we do not have to accommodate. Everybody needs to accommodate to us. There's a story, I was going to say a quote, but I can't remember it verbatim. But the story is about a US politician from the 1800s, I believe, if not the late 1700s, who said that every time he goes abroad to represent the US, he has trouble because he can't understand people. So when he goes to the Netherlands, he can't understand Dutch. When he goes to Spain, he can't understand Spanish, or to France, he can't understand French. And there's a solution to this. Get everybody to speak English. So when he goes abroad, it will be much easier for him because everybody will understand him and he will understand everybody. But in so doing, again, we narrow the worldview, we narrow the perspectives that languages bring with them or with themselves. We narrow that way of seeing the world that has been developed over time for solving problems, for interacting in communities, and just for our general well-being and development. Now, I did mention that outside of these few countries, the situation tends to be bilingual. Now, there are cases of bilingualism or multilingualism where the two languages are very different. They're not mutually intelligible. Very different in the sense that they do not share a common history. And when the languages do not share a common history, one tends to find that you do not get the languages butting heads, or rather the speakers butting heads, because the political situation is generally a bit different. And normally, speakers work out some sort of balance between the two and the domains in which they will be used. But more importantly, that balance and that deployment of the different codes does not necessarily suggest that one is inferior to the other, but that one is reserved for particular things, whereas the other is reserved for other things. Now that introduces the concept of diglossia, which was popularized by Ferguson. I think there is some sort of recognition that the term had been used before Ferguson, but in the format that we know it, it's Ferguson's definition that we go with. And for Ferguson, diglossia, really a prototypical diglossia, deals with communities in which there are separate varieties. Let me simplify and just say two, but generally there are multiple varieties in a community. So in a community where there are two varieties, one has high prestige and the other has low prestige. And the one that has high prestige is used in generally formal situations, education, the legal system, etc. And the one that has low prestige is used in intimate, private situations very often. Now, that suggests that the two varieties are existing peacefully, and that everybody has kind of accepted their own fate. The understanding in Fergusonian diglossia is that members of the community, if they don't speak, they do understand both, but that generally tends not to be the case. That very often those who speak the low variety do not understand the high variety. And many people who speak both the high variety and the low variety will actually swear that they do not understand the low variety. Now, in the clip that you played with Norman, there might be diglossia there because as he moves to some of the more intimate topics, he switches into Gaelic, whereas English is for those things that are a bit more distant. In communities like mine, Jamaica, we have what Hubert Devonish has called conquest diglossia, where the two codes are historically related, but the linguistic situation or the sociolinguistic situation has come about because of former colonization. And that colonization has produced a situation where the low variety is actually denigrated. So there's no equality in this sort of situation, whereas the high variety is seen as prestige and the variety that everybody should learn. To close, in communities like mine, where we do not get this equality in the two codes in the bilingualism, if the low variety is seen as a language at all, many members of the community treat the low variety like a disease or a diseased part of the body that needs to be taken care of. It needs to be treated or it needs to be amputated. And so over the past century or so, much of schooling in communities like Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, which have similar sociolinguistic situation, has been to eradicate the low variety, the Creole language, so that speakers can gain the high variety. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joseph. You've set out a good ground on which we can map out in more detail some comparisons, I think, with other situations. I'm sure Crocker is already linking with some of the situations that he's familiar with in Gaelic and Gaelic, Scotland and Ireland. So I'm going to ask Crocker to come straight in here and follow on from what Joseph has just given us so far.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you also, Joseph. That's a very interesting reaction to the power dynamics that Thoromit or Norman has identified in his clip there. And just to start on a personal point, it's interesting that Norman can be very sharp in two senses of this: sharp in his analysis, but sharp in his critique as well. And we got a good taste there of the incisive sharpness of how he dissected Trumpism, I suppose. Again, I'm struck how aware Thoromit or Norman is of his environment. Of course, he lived a long life and saw much social change. But the points I'm taking from that clip there now, the relationship between multilingualism or bilingualism and this enhanced perspective on different aspects of life. Then there's another one of, and this is where he's quite critical, the risk of self-deception in monolingualism, especially when that monolingualism is in a very, very strong language and all the sense of entitlement that goes with that. And then this very interesting point he has at the end there of the discernment that people get from a multilingual capacity. In other words, this ability, referential ability, an ability to reference cultural context beyond your own immediate context. I think that's very important for giving people an enhanced perspective and an openness to different views in the world. To go into a bit more detail and to react with what Joseph has just said there, it's some issues in relation to minority bilingualism, both individual bilingualism and then the issues of how the minority languages exist in the diglossic context. And from what we've seen in the Gaelic world, again, I'm using an example, but I think this is very particular to language, small languages that are threatened by the social process, societal process of language shift. And we see over and over again that a minority language that can maintain a high social density in a specific social geography, in other words, the locus, the locality of the speaker group, they, with the density and a collective adherence to the minority culture, they can maintain a minority predominance in a given area. In other words, the social geography of the minority language group. Then with contact, this is the issue we're discussing today, then they go through this mixed mode where it becomes clear in the minority group that the social use of the majority group is gaining ground. If that unfair dynamic then between the power of the majority language and the minority language is not managed correctly from the minority point of view, essentially they end up with just the majority language being predominant then in the former geography of the minority language. In other words, the process from one dominance to a mixed mode to another dominance, the dominance by the outgroup or the majority group. And this raises questions then of both bilingualism as an individual capacity, that obviously comes out of social praxis, social inputs, and then societal bilingualism, which is basically a dynamic in society. And to refer this back then to this issue of moving from minority local predominance to being dominated by the majority culture, this is essentially happening because of an asymmetry in the style of bilingualism that are the mode of bilingualism that we have in disfavored minority groups. And we know this argument from cognitive studies that the bilingualism is good for you argument, and that has been proved in various cognitive studies. But bilingualism in society is a much more difficult issue to deal with from the point of view of individuals and collectives, because of the asymmetrical power dynamics, that the majority group, through the power dynamics of their market and their state, they can more or less colonize or overtake and erode the social geography where the minority language had been previously dominant. And this brings us to the issue of the relationship between an individual capacity and the capacity of the collective to maintain its own dominance in the social geography where it flourished previously. And this is the challenge for parents, teachers, and language policy activists, that where the process of language shift begins to start, the social context, the social praxis for the minority language starts becoming more contracted, and it contracts down to a very, very narrow set of social functions and social domains. And in that situation, this is where the asymmetry threatens the actual societal reality of the speaker group, because the parents are finding themselves in a position where they're trying to compensate for a societal weakness. And that is why if language is only left to this individual or isolated parents trying to come up with their own mechanisms, basically what they're struggling with there is a neoliberal offer for the minority language, while the majority language takes over all the social context. So we have a collectivized majority language and an individualized minority language. And that is an unfair dynamic for parents and teachers to deal with. That is the challenge for the minority language, to bring some type of equity in that dynamic, to give the minority languages a fair chance. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Conchúr. Building on the societal context and how important that is in discussing this topic, I'm wondering if Udaya would like to come in next. And I'm struck by how the South Asian subcontinent is often defined in linguistic terms by its heterogeneity, as it were. And I get a feeling that there's sometimes a more relaxed attitude towards language in contact, languages in contact, than might be the case in other places where monolingualism is more of an expected norm. I don't know if you'd want to comment on that, Udaya, as part of what you would like to say.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. And I think what I've heard from Norman about his suggestion that perhaps would have been better if the followers of Trump had several languages or they came from multilingual communities. Their understanding of the world outside would have been much better. In fact, the bilingual balance that we have been hearing about, it's interesting to see a few things. First of all, about the diglossia point that Joseph was raising, let's look at the names given to the two codes in Indian situation. The name given in the Telugu speech community for the two codes, the H code is called Granthika and the L code is called Vyavaharika. Granthika means bookish, classical, archaic, pure. And Vyavaharika means practical. Look at the names given by the Bengali speech community. The H code is called Sadhu, that is sagacious. And the L code is called Cholit, the colloquial. So if you look at the attitude of these people vis-a-vis diglossia, there is an attitude of accommodation. People are trying to accommodate. So this is one point. Second point comes from the book by Prabodh Pandit called Language in Plural Society. It's a 1953 book. And the examples that he's given is that from a spice market in Bombay, the financial capital of India. And he says, look at the spice market merchants. You can't do any business in the spice market unless you know Konkani, which was still not a recognized language at that particular point of time. It was still considered to be a bad variety of Marathi. There is pushing it towards colloquialism. And Marathi is the elite thing. So, but then you must be able to speak in Marathi as you go out of the market to the people around. Then as you travel by the train to reach that Ghatkopar, you must be able to speak in some bit of English with the Anglo-Indian managers of the railway system. And you go to the cinema hall to see films, you must be able to see Hindi films. So at home, they would then go back and speak in Kutchi, because most of them came from the Kutch area, borderline between Pakistan and India in Gujarat. So in the life, there's so much of balance that they have to maintain. So if you ask this gentleman to use his Konkani for films, or use his Kutchi for travel, he won't be able to do. He has specific language for specific function. This is another point of view that I wanted to make. There is a kind of balance already, and this balance is to be respected, is to be understood in a very careful manner. And if you look at Jacques Derrida's monolingualism or the prosthesis of origin, this point of view, Derrida uses his autobiography to expose about his experience as a French speaker, and he uses two propositions there. He says, we only ever speak one language, or rather one idiom only. And then he says, we never speak only one language, rather there is no pure idiom. So if you understand what he means, he is actually saying that I have only one language and it is not mine. Because he is talking about the link between the relationship between the citizenship and language. A lot of people think that the colonial masters thought that they possess the language. And therefore, everybody must speak in my variety, my language, to be able to survive in my kingdom, my rule, etc. Not knowing that the language may not remain his property. It is possible that the colonized people will usurp that language and bend and mend it and mold it in so many ways, as all of us have done, Indians have done, Jamaicans have done, everybody has done, that each one of them becomes one of the best examples of how colloquialism would thrive and survive, and how that will be passed on from generation to generation. So I think the bilingual balance is a very crucial point that Norman has been making there in his video, which must come back to us again and again. And we need to understand each one of our social contexts, how the society is making the balance, and how an individual is participating in that social balance making exercise vis-a-vis languages or codes of languages. So I think that is something which is very crucial.
Good, thank you. So I think what we're getting down to here is particularities and how there's no silver bullet for any of this, is there? And in different places and different geographies, then there are different ways of approaching this, whether you want to see a situation maintained or whether you want to see a situation changed. So thank you to Joseph, Crocker and Udaya for those introductory points. I want to open it out again now to Kalyan and Audrey. Again, I think Jane is probably going to sit this out, but we'll be looking forward to her recorded comments, which we will be splicing onto the recording so that we do get the full input from the full panel. But Audrey, it's your turn to go first now. So off you go. Oh, well, let me just say before that I very much enjoyed your multilingualish poem, which you've recently broadcast. And it's an interesting example, isn't it, of how languages can work together. But you probably want to say more about that than I should.
Actually, thank you, Gordon, and everyone for your contributions. And as usual, it's very hard to zoom in on the point. So I will start with that multilingualish poem because the dominant language in it is Jamaican. And then there are interfaces with French and Spanish, which are both languages that I learnt. And also I'm learning Welsh, so I've sort of snuck in a couple of Welsh words. And the reason actually that one of the things that I could talk a bit more about that video, but I won't, because one of the reasons, for instance, that I wrote it was in response to being called Windrush. And I reject that title on so many levels because my family have traveled the globe and my father came here in order to move on from hardship in Jamaica. And nobody paid his journey, you know, all of those things. He came here as an adult male, you know, seeking to establish himself again because he was a bespoke tailor and he had his own shop in Jamaica. You know, he knew who he was, so did my parents. And the idea of being undermined again in this country was very difficult. But I won't actually, I could go on adding from that and say, let me stop there. But one of the things back to multilingualism that I feel that people have expressed, and the thing that really moved me in terms of that exploration was when I've been working, I work in different spheres, so as a teacher and as a psychotherapist. And one of the things that I was conscious of when I was working, for instance, with an organization that worked with disenchanted, sort of marginalized children, was that some of these children were African or Caribbean, and people were putting them in boxes of underachieving because, and I would say the because was they didn't understand how they spoke. And when I asked, because some of them were in there for speech and language therapy, and I said, have you checked what the home language is? Because they think, oh, they're behind because they don't know the difference between he and she, you know. And as I said, in some African languages, they don't make a distinction. Oh no, they've got a problem. And it was an insistence that they didn't have a problem. Now, I was working with a supervisor at that time, and I expressed in therapy, and I expressed my deep upset that people were not actually looking at the bilingualism of these children, whether they were Jamaican or African, you know, of African continent, and they were falling behind in school. And I was conscious of what will happen to these children if they're not conscious that they're bilingual, they're being put down because they seem to be underachieving, and yet they actually have deep treasures in their multilingualism and ability to progress despite being put back all the time. And so I was, I'd actually contacted the Jamaican language unit, long story cut short, about how can we explore the emotional impact and the cognitive impact of people who do not know they're bilingual in a monolingual society, when actually they bring so much that they're not aware of to the table. And this is, you know, it's actually still disturbs me because, you know, I'm not I didn't do linguistics, so I was, you know, it's always been hard to find the right path to put in multidisciplinary exploration. And it's still back to the thing of the dominant characteristic. I mean, I was conscious when I was doing French and Spanish that these were colonial empire languages, and yet I was curious about language. I didn't have the opportunity to learn an African language, and didn't recognize that actually at the point Jamaican was a composite African language. And so once I've embraced that, I can see that, yes, I have that journey, but there's still more to go. You might have to tell me when to stop because I will go along lots of different pathways in terms of multilingualism and how, you know, actually, I mean, people have been very polite about empire and colonialism because it was done to constructively undermine people and their cultures and take away the core of that person, which is language from my point of view. And I think that's where we need to sort of, you know, and at least, often people say Jamaicans punch above their weight. We are a weighty country and our language is powerful. And we're thankful that we can embrace that language and it's been globally embraced. So I still remain nationalistic on Jamaica, I'm sorry to say.
Great. Thank you very much, Audrey. And what I'll do, if you don't mind, I'll put a link to your poem in the information so that folk can actually view it for themselves. It's a powerful performance. So thank you very much for that. Okay, we'll move to Kalyan then. Kalyan, you come from a multilingual family, and you're a part of a multilingual family. Your wife is raised in Bulgaria, speaking Turkish. I don't know how many languages you've got in your own family background, but you're raising your son here in England, or there in England, I should say, from where I'm sitting. I don't know if you've got any reflections from that point of view, or if you want to say something different.
Just to say that, yes, I would like to say a few other things as well, if you don't mind, because I think individual, scattered, empirical, quote-unquote experiences in the raw don't necessarily explain themselves. They need contextualization. Now, the entire series has contextualized experience very well, I think. And when Joseph talks about power relations between languages, I think that's contextualized more, in a more grounded way by Crawher, in a sense, although Joseph in his first presentation in the first series already said it's socioeconomic, but Crawher mentions the social usefulness of language, which in turn is illustrated dramatically by Udaya in the Kutchi speaking, Konkani speaking, Marathi speaking, English speaking, Hindi speaking, or understanding spice trader from Maharashtra. So it's the functional relevance. These things matter because at the end of the day, in my opinion, it's not just a power relationship between languages. It reflects a power relationship ultimately between classes, between exploiters and exploited. And it reminds me in a stereotypical, the stereotypical joke about British tourists, some of them, refusing to go to Spain because they all speak Spanish there. But this joke at least dates back to Sweden in the late 18th century, when a Swedish philosopher, as some of you probably know, historians of language, he posited this image of paradise where God spoke to Adam in Swedish, because it was Sweden had just come to the top of the European power pyramid. So God spoke to Adam in Swedish, but Adam was constrained to reply in Danish. And for good measure, the despicable serpent whispered to Eve in French. While from this anecdote or speech scenario, it's like Eve herself was left literally speechless, because I don't know what language she was given to speak. But that hierarchy reflects the power relationships in reality on the ground, as people have mentioned here. Now, briefly, in my family situation, my son has grown up, despite my best efforts, understanding 200%, I'd say, Turkish and Bengali, which is a slight exaggeration. He understands almost everything in context without being handheld. But he prefers not to have to reply in either of those languages. To the extent he does choose to reply in a non-English language, he will do it in Turkish. And I think that's largely due to the fact of his greater degree of immersion in Turkish-speaking milieus, whether it's in Ayten's network of friends and relatives here, or the larger frequency, higher frequency of visits to Turkey, where almost no one speaks English. And he's exposed to a more dynamic, comprehensive, multi-directional kind of use of the language at all levels, with which he feels perfectly comfortable, and he interprets for me when we are there. I noticed that in Bengali, he lacking all of that, because I have no Bengali language support network here, and our visits to Kolkata, where everyone speaks English anyway in my family, are about once in 2 years at best. He has greater difficulty sometimes in generating, first of all, speech in Bengali, but also within that, sometimes slightly less degree of facility in mastering person, because he doesn't hear more than one Bengali speaker speaking. So it's always me to him, and he is the passive listener, and I'm the actor. The anecdote that I was briefly going to refer to illustrate what enabled me to at least get him to the stage where he can understand Bengali. I was at this health fair as an education project officer, and I watched this tall, blonde European woman speaking to the little black kid she was carrying in a language that I didn't understand. I went up to her afterwards and asked her what language she was speaking to him in. She said Finnish, but he also understands Lingala because his dad is Angolan. I said, that is fantastic. And can you also speak those languages? She said, absolutely. I said, how did you manage that? Because Rahul, my son, had just been born and I wanted him to get to that stage. She said, the best way to do it, what I do is whatever I do, I'm carrying him in my arms and I do a running commentary in Finnish. So he associates all the actions, all the feelings, all my thoughts, all the time, whether I'm speaking to him directly or not, he associates all those things with my language. I don't know if this luxury was affordable by the father as well, but it was what I tried with my son, with the limited time that I had between work shifts with him, whereas he was more at home and with Turkish-speaking families in the other language. The thing that I wanted to end with was this. Everything that we've discussed illustrates something that a very wise German philosopher said about a century and a half ago. And this relates to language hierarchies and the Swedish example and everything else. He said, right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development, which this structure determines. And a little earlier than that, he also said, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The problem, however, is how to change it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kalyan. That's great. Thank you. Again, a detailed picture of useful and interesting experiences. Thank you. Jane, do you want to speak or do you want to hold back and record later? Okay. So we'll go then to a few minutes of general discussion. If anyone wants to come back on any of the points which various others have made, now's your chance, and we'll get Joseph to finish off with a final summary after that.
One point that I wanted to raise here is that when you have several languages in a conundrum, in a society, in a kind of cultural space, there is, of course, the majority and the minority. This problem will come up. And the majority language group and the minority languages speech communities, they are likely to come in either clash or in some kind of an accommodative attitude vis-a-vis the majority languages. This accommodation will also depend on the economics. Who controls the market? Who controls the capital? If it is a small group which controls the capital and the larger majority language group which does not really matter in terms of finance and economics or business, then perhaps the whole game is a little different. You know, there is a respect that even a small group gets, which otherwise wouldn't be there. Whereas if the majority group also controls the market and the business and the finance and the politics, then the whole situation is different altogether. So if you look at the whole world, there are different kinds of majority-minority relationships, which of course there are sociolinguists like Schemerhorn who have tried to talk about this, theorize on these issues of what are the different kinds of relationships that might come up, depending on the balance or imbalance, or kind of sometimes balance, sometimes imbalance. So I was wondering if you've had some discussion with Norman on some of these kinds of issues of the politics of the language groups. Was there some kind of an interaction that you've had with him about from this angle of balance of languages?
Thank you, Udaya. I guess that's a question to me because it was me who had the conversation. The short answer to that is actually, no, we didn't go much further than what you've seen. On the Friday, we did talk about the place of Gaelic, whereas in the previous days, we had other topics for discussion. We've now between these 3 sessions, we've seen a full half of the whole of that conversation. So he chose a political example to illustrate his point there. And I've no doubt that he was very interested in political matters generally. And as Crocher's pointed out, he wasn't shy about expressing his own political preferences. At the same time, he was also a lay linguist rather than a professional linguist, if you like. So it's folk like yourself and Crocher and Joseph who, I mean, putting it bluntly, get paid to think about and talk about these things, that we look to tease out, if you like, some analytical points. Norman was a great observer and a great describer, I would say. And he did it in a way which was, the word tarangyach comes to mind. Crocher can help me. Compelling, if you like. It made you sit up and listen. But that's pretty much as far as we got, as far as a deeper kind of socio-economic analysis was concerned. So that's the longer answer there you've got. We did talk about all sorts of other interesting things, and I would recommend, if people get the chance and have been attracted by what we've been talking about over the past 3 sessions, to look in more detail, please go to the Searle Haramite site and have a look at the conversations which we had on Monday, genealogy, Tuesday, education, Wednesday, community. That perhaps relates again more closely to the kind of interest that you're expressing there, Udaya. And then Thursday, creativity, which might link again with some of the points which Audrey was making about, and perhaps links also more to the wider question about around bilingualism as to how what its enhancing powers might be. That here was a man who was comfortable in Gaelic and English, and also I think comfortable in another number of other languages, though not to the same extent. But he traveled the world by the age of 40. His mother never expected him to last beyond 40 because of the lifestyle that he led. But he confounded her there, in fact, doubling the target before passing on. So he has got a lot to offer. And a writer as well as a speaker, of course. And what I can do is I can put some links to his books in both Gaelic and in English, so that folk can sample some of his other product. That's probably all I'd want to say there. Any other interventions that need? Yeah, Crocher first, then Audrey.
Can I just conclude with a point from the initial recording that we showed and discussed, that he's seen in his lifetime, he's seen the complete transformation of his area from essentially a Gaelic speaking area with English speakers in it to an English speaking area with Gaelic speakers in it. And I think this raises the issue that a lot of official bodies and academic discourses shy away from. This point of having, especially when there's minority language recognition, that we have language promotion, but no coherent or credible language protection. And the way that relates to what we've discussed today is this issue of input from different societal functions and dimensions, and how that helps embellish our capacity in different languages, in the minority language we're talking about here. So to put the issue in a question, how are we going to help or ensure that future minority speakers have a capacity in the minority language and in the minority culture when there is so little or so constrained societal input. I think we need a whole new debate about that, given that so many of these minority languages are so vulnerable and so threatened.
Thanks, Crocker. Audrey?
Thank you, Crocker, because on the back of what you're saying, I was going to describe one of the things I've done is teach languages in schools. And our last job was doing supply teaching Spanish in primary schools. And one of the first things I did was check with the class how many of them spoke other languages. And in the majority of cases in London, there are about, for 30 children, there are about 28 languages in that class. And what I did first of all was get them to celebrate the fact that they all were multilingual. And so Spanish would just be another addition. This was short term, but actually what I'm curious about is why in the UK, we're not teaching the languages of the UK for a start, across the board, as well as embedding other languages, which, you know, to me, I've learned languages by being taught them, for instance, or being mother tongue. And there are various ways of getting the sort of language experience. And I mean, I suppose in the UK, people, as you say, people say, if you're English, you can't speak other languages. Obviously we can, but it's that laziness, I would say. So there is an opportunity, and particularly on this platform, to expand the language learning opportunity. And it enriches us all as far as I'm concerned. So let's see what we can do in terms of working with what we've got and building on it. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks all very much. Let's invite Joseph to make some concluding comments, and then we'll finish with the video from Norman.
Well, of course, I'm going to step away from the norm, just to say that I think the windows are beautiful enough in themselves that the curtains are superfluous. And I think, you know, the individual contributions were strong enough. And the beauty of the digital format is that people can always go back and listen, you know, to some of the things which were said, which I think are all very important. I'll just say that what has been underscored throughout, not only for today's discussion, but all three, is the fact that language is a social product. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within a society. And within that society, within that social structure, it is used for social purposes. And I guess I hear Crocker saying so, and sometimes not used because of that social context. And so I think the important thing coming out here is how do we get to an understanding of the social situation in order to help where that is needed. So it's not in all cases where there is a need to put in policy, for example, for protection, for preservation, although one never knows what that is, because it was pointed out that Norman in his lifetime moved from a situation where his language was the dominant language in the community from a numerical standpoint to a position where it was a minority language, which is a term I myself don't like, even with the understanding by majority and minority here, we are talking about politics and power, and not so much about number. But I think it's even worse when you're a numerical majority in your own space, but the language you speak is a minority language, and that situation is repeated all throughout the world. There's a quotation that I like, which says that how we view a language is really a reflection of how we view its speakers. And that, I think, is borne out in many of the cases that we are familiar with, that we participate in personally. But of course, that is an outward-looking view. It's one person looking at the other and that person's evaluation of language. So external to the individual, external to the subject. But I think an even more interesting case is what it says about the individual and the individual's own ideology and positioning, how they think about the languages that they use. And we can tell what somebody thinks about the language or languages he or she uses based on how those languages are used in the community. Sometimes the language used says, this thing is dying, so it doesn't make sense. I spend time on it, I devote resources to it. And so I think in addition to looking at, and we have throughout these discussions looked a lot at what other people think about languages, what other people think about the languages we speak, how they treat us because of how we speak. But there's also a space for reflection on how our own linguistic practices, I think this is borne out by the story told by Kalyan, how our own linguistic practices influence what happens to our languages. So do we speak to our children in our mother languages, or do we allow the community, and this is now echoes of Crawford's the individual versus the collective, or do we leave it up to the collective to socialize the child into language, even when that socialization is only in the majority language? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That's a great final summing up of what, for me at least, has been a fascinating series of discussions. So thank you all for taking part. Of course, we still have Jane's contributions to hear. It's a shame that you can't do that right now, but we'll certainly append them. And I'm sure that she will be not only making her own points, but wishing to comment as well additionally. So that's still to come. But we will finish with one last clip from Norman, not from Searle Hadamard, but actually from when he first came back to UIST, probably in his early 70s for the final stages of and I think a more peaceful final lap, if you like, where he found some respite back in the bosom of what was still a relatively Gaelic-speaking community. Just want to place on record here my own appreciation for his generous contributions to what we've been trying to do through Island Voices and what is now, we're now seeing through mediating multilingualism and so on. His generous contribution of copious recordings, which have serious insights to offer, lightly sprinkled with plenty of humor as well. So this final recording was actually made shortly after, as I said, shortly after he arrived, and it describes his arrival in UIST and the adventures he went through on his first night before he managed to get settled domestically. And I think we can all appreciate the way in which he relates this story and the way he does it, in fact, bilingually. Let's hear what he has to say, and do please, this is addressed to any viewers, do please take a look at the links, which will offer plenty more of similar material for your interest. Right, here we go with Norman.
to another horse, you know, it's a different ball game. I guess my horse in Narayana. As the Halgada smoke at Kilaundi. Oh, yeah, you're not going to Kilaundi, Haramet. What? Where am I going? You're going to the hospital. So she had the land, me Maur Sevatin, Palavani, as an hospital. Well, you can stay tonight. You're obviously you stay tonight, but we must get in touch with social services in the morning. Fine, NicLeòid cattle. Hadil me. Sevatin Hanike Jivora shows are such a right much DP on the niche. Displaced person. Story of my life, yeah, right. Als is zo heb ik het goed aan de B&B, maar yes, oh je, nu goed je, nu gaat B&B om een garden is na, kan er wij na pepper na, battige machine. Hij niet gaat gepatcht maar hoe, gaat er maar yes, hij is uit de jaraveltjes, hij is land mee, kon die maar pel, hij is zien verrommie, waar we aan Hans som kvitschachken. Har de ons haft med kitachken som heter det genius lepi var med hastigale morfin tablets. Kuju biket vi gasmena per I slap the it hosiken show me so vi show. That's right, about 20th of June. Gala phone school show. Gani kan tour va. Hallo heramet. Shanialika show, Hebridean Housing Association, show, Jenny Medut. Als is een hatuiak in goed. Katja's mission. Who is it all the brook had day? Oh, no, I don't think so. The only ranger supporter, and so no, I don't fancy that. Get me into Columba Place or someplace I know. Ten pickishes get blah. Be plaza jaunrug, opi at snog, haramet at snog. So, hush me yes on the spot, gundayenchen. I guess suk madi, suos me, I guess can't vanaves, you know, mahulute fazu, you know, rotatans. Go you, I'm a son pantale show. I guess beked veket, I can't come out opere draste, stille me day show, hashitsket, hapla. Even kun je het waar ook kroeien, nu dat voor jong college tegenwoordig. De gaat met staat dat really enjoy no. So hierin zo lekker, maar au heen hebben al naatje stellen me weer aan, eigenlijk ha noordem hientje hebben we toch jellen we, ha reunja kom heen, you know, zo geen pressure. I shouldn't really appreciate.
Thanks again to Gordon, and my apologies for not being able to speak before now. I didn't have much of a voice for a couple of weeks there, but now I'm back in full-throated voice, just ready for a new term to begin. Again, I'd like to repeat the privilege that it was to listen to the poetry that I hope is in the final recording from Audrey, and the many other bits and pieces that she shared with us as a cohort over the last few weeks. It's been lovely, and it's actually the part of language I think that appeals to Hebrideans the most. It is that creative side, that self-expression that you can have when you are considering your language in relation to the wider spheres. So my takeaway from all of this is that it is, as a day, saying, the economics, whoever has the control economically, controls the language the power relations between the languages, between the language groups, I should say, the public and the intimate that he referenced, and the high and low and denigrated and prestigious that Joseph referenced as well. And it is that eradication of the colloquial, of the heart language and the mother tongue that Audrey speaks of, that is happening, I think, to Gaelic, and that is making it difficult to rally people to do what would come naturally, just, returning to using their language. My biggest takeaway from all of this has been that throughout we've been referencing English, that unequal struggle between the minoritized language and dominance of the English language. But I keep returning to the thought that in many ways for native Gaels, it's a struggle between Gaelic and Gaelic at the at the institutional level, where all the power play happens and where the finances and economics are controlled. But I would add that at community level in Scotland, I've taught in mainland Scotland as well, new communities, whether it's teenagers learning or kids going through GME or adults learning, they all come to Gaelic because they love the language, and they sense that it's egalitarian and it's expressive and it is a language of the heart, and that's what appeals to them. So, at grassroots level, I think we would all be in agreement of how we feel about Gaelic, but there is this controlling factor that is explained beautifully. Any Islander, any Gael, any new speaker who's just beginning to learn Gaelic would benefit from listening to the analysis that all the experts have applied to the lived experience, and to even what they've drawn out of Taramot's recordings. And everyone referenced him earlier on, and one thing I remember is when I was a young editor at Grampian Television, he came in, he was hosting a magazine show, and in between recordings of segments, he was sitting there in the studio and the lighting guys were wandering about adjusting things, and somebody powder his nose and somebody play with his mic, and he was just throwing out these wisecracks, these plays on words throughout. And I was sitting in the gallery as a trainee editor with the director, Bob Kenyon, and I just said to him, should we not be recording all of this? And he just said, there isn't enough tape in the entire studio. He was constantly sitting there and critiquing and commenting in such an original way on everything, and his Gaelic was beautiful. So it's been lovely to listen to that, but also to listen to everyone else and to be amazed by what you've teased out of those recordings. And I think it'll have a great value for anyone who speaks Gaelic, whether they're lucky enough to have it as their native language or they're just attracted to it and wanting to belong to something like Gaelic. I think the differentials there, the power play between Gaelic and English and between Gaelic and Gaelic institutions has been very valuable indeed. And I appreciate Gordon allowing me to be part of this panel. It really has been a great privilege. And I will leave it at that.
¿Cómo llegaste aquí? Hungry belly, run clear of Panama. We look walk till me back broke. Them take me woman, kill me picnic for nothing. What a way you come from? How you end up here? Must you from one place called Scotland? Plenty hill, plenty green, and the sea skirt over our feet. Is all you gone clear of Scotland? Is all you reach up there? Hungry belly. Catch boat come a England. Reach a Southampton by the sea. Reach a London, best suit. Fi look walk till me back broke. Send for me woman, them kill me picnic. For nothing. Me no see, me no see no mountain. Grace Hotel. Go on back home. Well, they know me name, they know me family. Me a smaddy. Take me woman, left the picnic. Them alright.